Hey, everybody. Yeah, I have no shame whatsoever. It's obvious I love my Yoda stuff. So here, no shame. Yoda is obviously a what? A unicellular or a multicellular being? Obviously a multicellular, but we're not sure exactly what type of cells he has because he's a different species. So yeah, I decided I was going to dress up for you today since it's before the holidays. Yes, if you were wondering, I do go out with this. I know, it's crazy. But right now I'm going to take it off just so I can go ahead and teach because it's going to be just a tad distracting. And we are going to finish up talking about unicellular and multicellular organisms so that you are ready for your quiz on Friday. You have a video that kind of reviews everything on Friday, and then you are ready to go. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we can continue our PowerPoint from yesterday. Wednesday's multicellular organisms. The definition, multicellular organism, we're going to concentrate on that today to see the differences between the unicellular one. It's an organism made up of 2 or more cells, multiple cells, can be as small as mites. Again, you got your little fun video on face mites over there in case anybody wants to watch it again. It is lovely. Information. These organisms need all parts of themselves to survive. Their cells specialize with few exceptions. So you need all the different types of cells that are in your body, for example, in order to survive. They all do a particular job. Common names, many-celled organisms. The multi-celled organisms are mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, insects, plants, fungi. So you see we've got some decomposers in there, and we have some producers in there, and of course we have some consumers in there. So these are examples of multicellular organisms: humans, cats, dogs, insects, birds, flowers, mold, trees. All of these are multicellular. And again, images here of multicellular organisms, just to give you an idea. Now, how do they feed for energy? Let's, what I'd like you to do right here, let's go ahead and open this up, and hopefully the sound will be working since I have it supposedly on. Now, here's how unicellular organisms actually feed so that you can see it. Because we know, based on what we've done on ecosystems, we know how the rest of the living organisms get their nutrients. But let's see these unicellular organisms in particular. How do they get their nutrients?
Despite huge differences in morphology and biological structures, all living organisms do the same 3 basic things. They get food, digest it, and excrete waste materials. Living organisms require energy to live. Some produce their own food, usually through photosynthesis. We call these autotrophs. But many organisms cannot make their own food. We call these heterotrophs, and they eat. Among heterotrophic single-celled eukaryotes, food is taken into the cell in various methods, but once it's there, it's wrapped by a membrane and forms something called a food vacuole. Then the cell flushes digestive enzymes inside the food vacuole to start the digestion. Nutrients are taken into the cytoplasm, and the waste material left in the vacuole then basically fuses with the outer membrane of the cell, and what's left in the vacuole is discharged into the environment. In some cases, like inside this beautiful single-celled Nacella ornata, which feeds on filamentous cyanobacteria, content of the food vacuole reacts with the digestive enzymes and changes color. But that process takes time. Because each vacuole formed at a different time, they are in different stages of digestion, which gives this cell its colorful polka dots. But how do these heterotrophic organisms get their food? Well, in spite of a remarkable amount of diversity, a lot of microorganisms use one of the same 3 strategies for getting their food. Some of this will be familiar to the macro world, some of it will not. One of the less familiar is filter feeding, which allows larger organisms to consume suspended food particles or much smaller organisms. There are filter feeders in the macro world. Baleen whales come to mind. But while a whale must swim through giant clouds of small organisms in the microcosmos, your food can come to you. Some filter feeders use hair-like structures called cilia to create a vortex that brings other microorganisms or food particles to the cell mouth. These cilia are specialized for this task, and their beating creates a current that expediently and beautifully directs every nearby thing into the waiting mouth of the microorganism. The cilia are often too small for us to see, but you can see their effects. Take a look at these paramecia. They're consuming tiny bacteria, and you can see their cilia causing small organisms to tumble across them. You can also see all of their food vacuoles on the inside, and if you look very carefully, you can see a new food vacuole forming and getting filled up with those tiny bacterial cells. Some of the best and most obvious filter feeders are rotifers, microanimals that use cilia to create swirling vortices around their mouth parts. You can see how successful this feeding strategy is by its belly full of algae cells. Every time its mouth fills with more algae, it contracts to swallow the food. Now observe these single-celled organisms called stentors. They are much bigger than most other microorganisms. You can actually see them with the naked eye. And they also use filter feeding to push all of their algal food into their cell mouths. Our second feeding mechanism, maybe the most familiar and the most exciting, is called raptorial feeding. Raptorial feeders selectively capture prey and hunt other organisms. In this video, you can see Dileptus hunting. It paralyzes one organism with a touch of its trunk-like proboscis, and then it pulls that organism into itself in a process called phagocytosis. Many of these microorganisms are armed with something called toxicysts. These are little harpoon-like structures filled with toxins, and they're located on a particular part of the cell, which the microorganism uses for hunting. These tiny harpoons are then fired when they come in contact with prey organisms, which then become immobilized. This is Bursaria. It's a single-celled organism with a huge mouth, and things have not gone well for the paramecium that is now inside it. The paramecium dies immediately because of the toxicists on the inside of the Bursaria, so at least it was quick. Now get ready for some truly gorgeous footage of a microanimal's day going south. First, Paradileptus immobilizes the rotifer with fired toxicists, and the animal is swallowed by the single-celled organism as it swims away. This is Frontonia, which is a close relative of Paramecia, but it lacks the filter-feeding habits of its relatives and feeds predaciously on large diatoms and filamentous cyanobacteria, such as Oscillatoria here. Though in this case, it turns out this Frontonia bit off a little more than he could chew. Another raptorial feeding style is called histophagy. Histophagous organisms, such as these single-celled coleps, attack injured but live animals or other single-celled organisms, sucking off hunks of tissue rather than consuming whole organisms. When they attack an animal, they enter wounds and ingest tissue, often attacking in groups because their chemical sensing abilities attract many of them from a distance, like microscopic vultures. When a number of them gather in one place, it's hard to avoid another macro world analog, piranhas, devouring everything soft in no time at all. There's a huge variety of raptorial feeding. This is just the beginning, but we wanted to show you one more before we move on. This is Vampirella, an amoeba with a suitable name. It specializes in feeding on filamentous algae. First, it bores a hole through the algal cell wall, and then slurps out the gooey, nutritious cytoplasm.
So you can understand really how these little organisms, it's just one cell, and yet they have that capacity. They have to, in order to survive, they have to find those nutrients, but they hunt in different ways, or they're just there and something comes to them and they just suck it in. But regardless, it's interesting to me that these unicellular organisms have all these different capacities and how many there are. You know, we talk about a few, and I said you've got to memorize amoebas, you have to memorize, you know, that whole list that we talked about, because it might be on a test, but there are many, many, many more. And what we used to do at school is we would go and get a sample from like a pond or a lake, you know, a sample of water. And then we would put it in slides under the microscope, and you would actually see these unicellular organisms, just like you saw in the video, live, moving around. So that was a cool experiment that we did. Let me go back here to our PowerPoint slideshow. You can see here there's a paramecium feeding on yeast. Yeast is one of those things that's super important. We have yeast growing inside of us. That's one thing that we all have. But yeast, it's also the same stuff that makes bread rise, right? It's very important for our digestive system, and our we get nutrients from it. But the paramecium here feeding on this yeast, you can see it just kind of surrounds it and just sucks it in from all different places. They're multicellular organisms, again, to review. They're able to adapt and have different traits. They do have cell differentiation. They do consist of 2 or more cells. They do grow larger and more complex. So that kind of gives you an idea, because our next unit is going to be on human body systems. So we're really going to concentrate on us as a living organism. So your exit ticket for today is to complete a Kahoot quiz on unicellular versus multicellular organisms. You will see a link for it on Canvas. Make sure you complete that, please, so that we can see what you understand and what you don't understand, and we can help you before the quiz on Friday. Peace out. I've had a wonderful time actually being with you this week and explaining unicellular versus multicellular organisms. Peace out, my friends. Have a wonderful holiday season when it begins. Thank you very much for watching and listening.